Hi everyone. So you all took the midterm for this class in week 8, and I did give some individual feedback on a number of those questions as I graded them, but I also wanted to just record this short video to go over a few common themes that emerged as I graded them, and just specifically address a few of the questions that I think are particularly important moving forward. So I'm just going to do that right here. So we're starting with number 6, which was in the multiple choice question section, and it was, which of the following is an example of an article database? And a couple things could have tripped you up. We obviously use the UWG library catalog to search for resources, but instead of being an article database, that's what we call a library catalog, which is going to primarily show you books that are held by the library. And then Galileo was the other kind of trick answer. And if you remember back to class, I said that Galileo should be thought of as kind of a virtual library. So in the same sense that Ingram Library here on campus is a physical library, this is a virtual library where it's a starting point, kind of a virtual platform where you then can find all the individual article databases and search those. So Galileo isn't a database itself, it's more of a platform that you use to find databases. And one of those is, of course, Academic Search Complete, which we all used a number of times in our research projects. But then other databases include subject-specific resources like PsycInfo or EconLit or Medline or Business Source Complete. So there's a lot of different databases that you find in Galileo, but remember that Galileo isn't actually an example of a database itself. So then number 8 was which of the following is a good strategy to narrow your research topic? And so I'll just go through these really quick. So limiting your research to your personal opinion, that's really no good, because really the whole point of doing a research project is to broaden your own views past your personal pre-existing perspectives and really expose yourself to new ways of thinking. And then you make your stance really based on what evidence is out there and what seems the most convincing to you. So that one's out. Doing a Google search and making your topic the same as the first good source you find. A good source is obviously positive, but this is still a bad strategy because you're not really adding anything new or analyzing your topic. Really, to be able to take a stance and narrow something down to something researchable and interesting, you need to expose yourself to a broad range of views. So just by looking at one, that's really not good. And then finally, there's of course a lot of types of information that you won't find on Google, and you shouldn't exclusively rely on it. And then the final one, of course, is no good, because keeping your topic broad, that's going to result in an ineffective topic and then a lower quality paper. So that really leaves the correct answer, which is to search for your topic on Wikipedia and Credo reference to learn background info. And you should remember this was one of the exercises that we did in one of the first weeks when we were just getting started, and you needed to narrow your topics. And remember, these are examples of reference sources, which are things like encyclopedias and specialized resources that you really use to browse for specific facts rather than read them from beginning to end. So you should have remembered doing that as part of your research process, and this is a really good idea when you want to narrow your topic. So the next one was a little tricky, and you needed to do some of the readings about scholarly sources to really know this. So I asked, all these following things are found in a scholarly journal article except which one? So an abstract, that is definitely found there, and that's really the name of the summary of the contents of the article, which is usually about 200 words or so, and you'll find this in the databases as well as the article itself. So it kind of describes the problem, gives an outline of the study, and kind of the main argument. So the reason that scholarly articles have abstracts is so that researchers or students like yourselves can quickly decide whether this article really meets your needs. So if you're writing a research paper, is this one going to really be relevant to me or not? So that's what an abstract is. References to publications by other authors. So that one's you definitely do find that. That's one of the major factors of something being a scholarly article, is that it includes works cited, and those are often found either at the very end of the article or within a footnotes section. And then the credentials of the author, they are included in a scholarly article. So these might appear with the author's names. It might say the university that they're affiliated with, or it might also appear as a footnote or an endnote to the article. But this is really provided to kind of help establish the authority of those authors and give a point of contact. But you will find the credentials, at least in the sense of probably the university that the author is affiliated with. So the one that's left, and the one that is not found, is an index of concepts and terms in the text. So this is the kind of thing, so an index is what you'd find at the back of the book, and it says which page a certain concept or name or idea is on. So articles are usually so short that this really doesn't make much sense, and indexes are what you would actually see in book sources, not journal articles. So then moving on to number 11, this was about primary sources. So I just wanted you to remember that a primary source has kind of a specific definition in research, and that is a document or object which was written or created during the time under study. So the word primary can mean important, or you might think, my primary source is the one I use the most, but that's really not correct here because primary source has a specific definition that we talked about in this class. So primary sources, you should always remember, it's something, either a document or an artifact even of some sort that was really created during that time. So if you're studying World War II, a newspaper article that came up during one of the battles would count, or a diary, or some other type of original work. So many of you have given good examples of primary sources in our discussions, so hopefully everyone remembers that now. So number 12 was these different things that describe secondary sources. So articles that review previous studies in a field, that's a very common type of secondary source, and those previous studies are sometimes primary. Sometimes you could call this a literature review. Articles that take selected research data and present it in a new way to a different audience. That's another classic example of a secondary source. So this could be something like, say, for example, a popular magazine article in, Time or Newsweek that's really talking about some sort of experiment and really taking that, and the original kind of research article would have been aimed at more of a specific audience, but then this popular magazine article, which is still a secondary source, would be kind of translating that research and presenting it to a more general, broad audience. Books that explain the effects of particular events, such as World War II, that's another good, reporting an event. It's after the fact, so it's not primary, so that's another good example of a secondary source. So really the one that's left is articles that provide a basic understanding of a topic in an easy-to-digest format, and this should have rung bells in your head that this is really what a tertiary source is. So something like an encyclopedia that really is only created after a scholarly consensus has really been achieved in a particular area, which, as of course you remember in the ordering question, this is what happens last, but this is really exactly what a tertiary source is, not a secondary source. So that one was the answer here. And then number 14 was an example of a reference source. So remember, as I mentioned earlier in this video, the definition of a reference source is really kind of specific. So it's something that's browsed specifically for facts rather than read from beginning to end. So that's like an encyclopedia, a dictionary, an almanac, or possibly a biography. So the Encyclopedia of Earth is an encyclopedia, so that fits. So that was the answer. And then in contrast, the other ones, an article database, that's not a reference source. That's just a search tool for finding journal articles. Remember, Galileo is a virtual library as a whole, so that has tons and tons of different types of sources, so it's not just a reference source. And then Google, of course, is a search engine that could bring up some encyclopedia type articles, but that's not all that it does. So it's clearly does much different than what a reference source does. So moving on, and this video is getting a little longer than I was expecting, so hopefully stick with me for a few more minutes. Google, so this was another one, and if you remember back to our first couple weeks of class, I mentioned that Google takes a number of different signals into account when determining rankings, so it's not based solely on the number of people who have visited them, the web pages. Instead, really the key feature that the Google algorithm is based on are the amount of links that point to those pages. So the logic is that if someone's linking to a page, they're basically vouching for it and saying this is trustworthy. So of course that would be kind of easy to reverse engineer and kind of scam it, and obviously with the proliferation of different types of spam websites, people do this a lot. So the Google algorithm is very complicated and now takes in tons and tons of different factors into account, but it's definitely not based solely on the number of people who visited the sites. Always shows you the most trustworthy sites at the top of page 1. That's the idea that Google's trying to do, but as we saw in a lot of our searches and in a lot of your sort of website evaluation exercises earlier on, it's not necessarily the best at the top of the first page. Since it's, this is all done by just a computer algorithm, there's no humans at Google who are deciding which sites to show up first, because that would just be impossible with the billions of web pages that are out there. These computers, they have a pretty good formula, but they have no way to really measure trust as we would understand it as humans. So that one was wrong. And then the final two are really, they can't really both be true at the same time. So it had to be one of those, because searching all electronic resources that exist regardless of where they're held, that really contradicts, the second one, which is searches what is available for free on the internet but does not see into paid library databases. So this is really the true, this is the right answer, because Google does search whatever it can crawl. So it sends out these little things called web crawlers that just search the whole web and then add new pages into the Google index. And the reason that you can't just find your library research articles and books just through Google is because they can't see into certain resources that are blocked by various types of login screens. So remember, you can only search library databases because you're a student at West Georgia. So Google, isn't able to see into those databases. So this one about existing regardless of where the resources are held is not true, because this is one counterexample of a type of electronic resource that exists but can't be searched by Google. So this was the correct answer for number 15. And then number 17, about where we can look on the library website to find databases in a particular subject. So some of you said the UWG library catalog, and I think I see what you were trying to mean, but that's not quite right. So you were probably talking about this search engine here on the home page of the library. And you can go to the articles tab and then browse databases here. So that's one good way you could do it. But what this is really just doing is just sending you into Galileo. So that's kind of the same thing as just saying Galileo, which you could just get to by clicking this link over here on the left. So really, remember what the UWG library catalog is this search interface specifically for finding books and ebooks. So you can't find specific article databases or even individual articles through the library catalog. This is what you just use to search for books. But you can actually get to the databases by using this little search engine, but the search engine isn't the exact same thing as the library catalog. Remember, the search engine, the default is to search the library catalog, but if you search any of these other things, it's really just sending you into Galileo. So you could have used that as one of your ways, but you should have remembered the second way that we talked about for a while in this class was the research guides, or often called libguides, that are created by UWG librarians. So remember, they've got them by different subjects over here. So in my example, if I'm doing something related to psychology, I can just click on that right here. And this is a good place where I can actually look and see a bunch of suggested article databases right here by the subject librarian at Ingram Library. So that was what I was looking for, those two answers to this question, number 17. And then I guess to get on to a couple of the last ones, well, a lot of you actually gave good answers for how you can tell a scholarly article from a popular article, so you can go back and look at those criteria. If you might have struggled with that one, there's a bunch of readings that just really go through that and even show some examples of these two. And then just to wrap up, so we had these research questions that you were supposed to tell me if they were good or bad, and really the main problem with the first one was that there's no analysis. So a big component is not just how narrow or broad it is, but really if it's uncovering anything new. So in this case, just the features of the latest iPad is it's really just going to result in a simple summary of existing sources. There's really going to be no new knowledge created, so there's really no point of this research. I could just go on the Apple site and just find that in 5 minutes. Who's the worst U.S. politician currently in office? The big problem with that, as most of you identified, was that it's going to be it's really an opinion. It's asking for something that can't be proven. So what's the worst for me might be different for you. There's really no way to objectively measure what makes someone worse than someone else. So you'd have to rewrite this question into something much more specific that you could actually measure and evaluate. So maybe the U.S. politician who is the most dangerous for the economy, or the most dangerous for the environment, or something like that. But then you can actually have a metric that you would research and come up with more specific evidence rather than just someone who's worse than someone else. The history of the field of philosophy. This one probably looked kind of good to some of you because it's an academic field. It seems like a fairly appropriate thing to be doing research on, but remember, this is a 5-page college paper, and what we talked about before was that this is going to be far too broad. So just think of, philosophy goes back to the ancient Romans and Greeks, and so there's, thousands of years of history. It's gone through so many developments. There have been, countless philosophers who have done major things to change the field. There's many different subfields today. So how are you possibly going to approach that and take some stance and argue something interesting in a 5-page college paper. So to do that, you would have to focus on something much more specific within the field of philosophy in order for that to be appropriate. So if you were going to try to cover everything in philosophy, it would be impossible in 5 pages. Rather than anything beyond really just an elementary school level summary. So good research is not a summary, so that was not a good research question. And the final one, this was an example of a good one, so you can see that it's specific in scope, it's appropriate, it answers all the who, what, where, why, when questions, and that was a good one. So they weren't all bad, but these first 3 did have serious problems with them. So that was really what I wanted to cover about the test, and I can see this video has gone a little longer than I was expecting. So thanks for your time, and I hope that was helpful. So of course, let me know if you still have any questions about the test or any of the other materials, and we'll see you next time.